This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, the decorated combat veteran, author, and foreign policy expert. You are widely recognized for your leadership in the Battle of 73 Easting during the Gulf War, where you orchestrated an offensive strike that destroyed 70 Iraqi armored vehicles with no U.S. casualties in 23 minutes in what was the largest tank battle since World War II. You retired from the military in 2004 after 28 years of service and became a commentator on CNN, the BBC, and Fox News, where you regularly appeared on the Tucker Carlson Show. You have testified as an expert witness before the Senate and House Armed Services Committees, and in 2020, Donald Trump appointed you as senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense. You've written 5 books on military transformation, including Breaking the Phalanx and Transformation Under Fire. You have argued that Ukraine is being destroyed and that Russia will win this war, while the media and government propagate false narratives to hide the true reality of the situation. Colonel Macgregor, welcome to London Real.
Well, good summation, except that I served for 28 years, but that's all right.
All right, excellent stuff. I guess let's jump right into it. The Ukraine war, there's a reality and there's a media narrative that I feel here in the UK and in the US we get a heavy dose of. Why are those so different, in your opinion? And what is really going on the ground in Ukraine versus what I just read at the Times in London or what I read in the New York Times on a regular basis?
Well, I think it's more than just a narrative now. I think the West, led primarily by Washington and London, has erected what I would call an empire of lies. It's truly devastating and it's shocking in its scale and impact. It's something that, frankly, I was completely unprepared for. I've never seen anything quite like this, where systematically we have lied about everything involving Russia and Ukraine now for months, if not years. And the truth of the matter is that people have never been told or not being told, and you can find the truth, but you've got to look for it, obviously, on the internet, is that Russia is by no means the evil aggressor in this thing. If anything, Russia launched an operation that it felt it had to secure its country. We have been working tirelessly for at least the last 20 years to undermine and weaken Russia in whatever way possible. We decided we didn't care much for Mr. Putin and his success at essentially retrieving Russia from the ash heap of history. And then the Russians made it very clear that they would not accept NATO on its borders. I mean, effectively, they'd done that with Latvia and Estonia. They do have a border up there, but they made it very clear that Ukraine, which is roughly the size of Texas and the United States, could never be a member of NATO, that simply presented too much of a danger. They made that clear in 2008 at Budapest. We ignored it. And then subsequently, Mr. Putin has given speeches reiterating the criticality of neutrality for Ukraine, unwilling to see NATO bases there. In 2014, one of the principal reasons that he intervened to seize Crimea was to prevent that naval base from falling into the hands of what he expected would be NATO forces. And remember, whenever he says NATO, he ultimately means the United States. It's the United States Navy that would have gone into the ports in Crimea. It's the United States Armed Forces that is moving eastward towards the Russian border. And we've chosen not to discuss that. 2014, you also had this coup that we helped to organize and implement, which put people in power that otherwise would never have gotten there. And these people were violently anti-Russian, hostile to Russian national security interests. We encouraged that. We cultivated it. We began pouring money into this thing called the Ukrainian army. Really, it's more the army than anything else. And in 2014, this fledgling Ukrainian army began immediately attacking the Russians in eastern Ukraine, in the so-called provinces or oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk. And in the time between the first attacks by artillery in 2014 and the intervention by the Russians in February of 2022, they killed 14,000 people. And they fired thousands and thousands of rounds of artillery. In fact, in the week or two just before the Russians finally moved in, they fired over 2,000 rounds of artillery ammunition. And these were all being fired at Russian civilians. Now, notice I say Russian civilians. They were technically Ukrainian citizens. They just happened to be Russians. And, of course, these Russians were being oppressed. They were effectively presented with a fait accompli. Either you become Ukrainian, you stop speaking Russian, you speak Ukrainian, you write in Ukrainian, and you adopt Ukrainian identity and culture and so forth, or we're going to punish you. And so the Russians in eastern Ukraine have been second or third class citizens now for years. All of this did not go down well in Russia, as you can imagine. And then, of course, we had this thing called the Minsk Accords, which was, in theory, presented to the Russians as a way to get past the conflict and maintain some measure of civility and peace in Ukraine. Well, it didn't work, and it didn't work, as we've discovered, because first Chancellor Merkel, who's now retired, and then subsequently Mr. Macron, the president of France, both admitted the whole thing was a hoax. It was simply a device to buy time for the Ukrainians to build their forces up. And it became very clear to the Russians that this large force, which is extremely well equipped and I would argue reasonably well trained, certainly by NATO standards, was poised to launch an attack at Russia with the goal of crushing the Russians in Luhansk and Donetsk and then ultimately retaking Crimea. So the Russians said, no, thank you. And they intervened. The big mistake they made is that they assumed that someone was willing to negotiate with them. And so they went in with a really small force, no more than 90,000 on the ground in terms of combat troops. And they discovered after 2 or 3 months, 4 months, even though they were not taking heavy casualties as originally reported, they took very light casualties. It was the Ukrainians that had begun taking heavy casualties almost from the beginning. They discovered that they weren't going to get a negotiated settlement. Finally, the generals met with Putin last summer and said, this is a war. This is not what we bargained for. We miscalculated. The underlying assumptions were wrong. There is no one to talk to. And you'll recall that shortly after your former prime minister's visit in April to Mr. Zelensky, that any hope of talks was crushed. And ultimately, they said, we've got to get ready for a real war. That meant mobilizing reserves, expanding the size of the army, training everybody up, re-equipping people, because the equipment they used initially was almost all obsolescent. So that was completed by Christmas. Then there was pressure to launch an offensive, but the weather didn't cooperate, so the decision was made, since we don't have firm ground, and you recall that in that part of the world you have this thing called the Rasputitsa, which is effectively a sea of mud that makes it virtually impassable for armored fighting vehicles or wheeled vehicles. If you leave the hard surface road, you're in big trouble. If you go back to World War II, you find that the major offensives were either launched in the dead of winter when the ground was frozen, or they were launched in June, July, August, September timeframe. So the Russians then said, fine, we'll build an impregnable defense, hold what we've got, and invite the Ukrainians to attack us. And in the meantime, the Ukrainians have taken terrible, terrible losses. And these losses have never been truthfully reported in the Western media, because I think Washington was very concerned that if it became clear that the Ukrainians were dying at great numbers, their forces were being destroyed almost faster than they could be fielded, that support for this insane notion of waging a proxy war on the backs of the Ukrainian people against Russia would no longer be supported in NATO. So the easy solution was lie. And then you have a compliant media that is ideologically aligned with the globalist neocon governments in the West, especially Washington and London, and it becomes very easy to tailor the message to somehow or another sustain support. And remember, Russia still has the legacy of the Cold War behind it, and what that means is that it's easy to convince people that Russians are bad, Russians are evil. After all, wasn't the Soviet Union bad and evil? Of course, this is not the Soviet Union. This country today is radically different. If anything, it is extremely religious, culturally conservative, and I think the Russian military, contrary to what's being reported in the Western media, has behaved extraordinarily well, is not guilty of 90% of the war crimes of which it's being accused. On the other hand, the Ukrainian military has behaved atrociously and murdered people in large numbers and celebrated it in Nazi fashion. So at the end of the day, this is an empire of lies. Now, here's some good news. Empires of lies create truth bombs, and the truth bombs are beginning to explode. And I'm sure that you're aware of the leaked documents, but also more and more information from the battlefield is slipping through. Reporters who are not part of the mainstream are there, and they're telling the truth. So it's harder and harder to maintain the fiction that the Ukrainians are winning, that the Ukrainians ever could win, that the Russians are losing, and the Russians are incompetent, incapable, and stupid. just as it's become impossible to argue that the Russian economy has been harmed at all by the sanctions. On the contrary, the Russian economy is doing quite well. So I think that's where we are right now. The Russian military is waiting for the ground to dry. More Ukrainians are attacking. They've lost now at least 300,000 dead. I've seen higher estimates than that. The Russians are looking at perhaps 30,000 killed in action and perhaps 40, 50,000 wounded. But the difference between Russian wounded and Ukrainian wounded is that Russian wounded are quickly evacuated, their wounds are treated, and they're returned to duty, about 90% of them. Whereas the Ukrainian side doesn't do that as well, can't do it as well, and large numbers of people are dying of wounds on the battlefield. So it's a treacherous situation. I think it's a humanitarian crisis. We haven't even discussed the tens of millions of people whose lives are destroyed in Ukraine. 11 million plus have now left the country. I've seen estimates that suggest that they started with 34.5 million in the country. They're down now to somewhere around 18 or 19 million. And the Ukrainians, they're coming out now and have been coming out from the beginning, all report they have no intention of going back. And we haven't even begun to address the child trafficking and trafficking of women that has gone on without a break, and the black market for much of the material that we've sent over there. And obviously the squandering of cash that ends up in bank accounts in places like Cyprus belonging to people like Zelensky and the key figures in his operation, including generals in the Ukrainian army, even down to the battalion level. This is a disaster. We should put a stop to it right away and try to rescue as much of Ukraine as we can.
You know, Colonel, I think it was Sun Tzu that said all warfare is based on deception. And a lot of times the media has been co-opted into this, and we saw that with Vietnam, et cetera. You just laughed out loud. I mean, how is this any different than any other military conflict? Is it the scale of the deception here?
Yeah, I think so. And also the cooperation of the media. You know, I lived through the Vietnam era. In fact, I started out in the military in 1971 at Virginia Military Institute, then went on to West Point in 1972, and we were still dealing with the Vietnam disaster. And it was very clear that at least until 1968, the media was giving the military a pass. They were essentially reporting figures for casualties that were not accurate. They were slow rolling our own casualties, increasing and inflating the casualties on the other side. And of course, promoting the notion that we were winning. And you had a massive campaign launched by the president and the senior four-star at the time, Westmoreland, in 1967, to convince everybody we, quote unquote, turned the corner. We're winning. Then, of course, we got the Tet Offensive in January, and it was a disaster. And it became abundantly clear to everyone, and the media could no longer pretend. And the media was less interested in pretending. You still had a lot of people in the media with some sense of integrity and devotion to the country. They began to tell the truth. That made lots of people angry. These were the Americans that had believed the lies from the beginning. And of course, we didn't even discuss the fact that the whole war was based on a lie. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, which really never occurred as it was reported. It's not the first time that we've gone to war for a lie. We went to war in 1917 on the basis of lies as well. So the bottom line is that I think today what's different is the willingness to lie, the willingness to deliberately deceive. And I listen to it every day, every morning, on every news channel. I read it all the time. And you sort of shake your head and say, this is incredible. But the good news is the truth bombs, they're beginning to detonate. And very shortly I would think, as soon as this ground dries to the point where hundreds of thousands of Russian forces can leave their defensive positions and attack, it'll be very difficult to maintain the fiction anymore.
It's interesting. We had Seymour Hersh on the show last week, and he's been on 2 times. And, you know, he broke the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, and, you know, he was on the side of truth back then. He worked at the New York Times for a long time. Now, they won't print any of his articles about Nord Stream bombings, about the real situation on the ground. It's just like everything has almost gone 180 degrees to where he's looking for, where are the journalists these days? What do you make of that? The fact that it's just turned that much? Or do you have any opinions on Seymour and some of the things that he puts out?
Well, Cy Hersh is a very brave man, and he does the best that he can to report the truth. Sometimes minor details are inaccurate, but the larger truth that he disseminates is accurate and helpful. And I think he's telling the truth this time around about Nordstrom, but I have no way of knowing. I haven't seen any classified material. He certainly told the truth in the past about Vietnam, told the truth about the Gulf War, too. There's some incidents involved, people there. I think right now you have a class of people in the West who have grown rich and comfortable from their participation in what I would call the globalist cabal. That ranges from everything, including the massive printing of money as a substitute for productivity, to open borders, the systematic attacks on our culture, our identity, who we are, what we are, our history. And of course, many of these people are privately very sympathetic, I would say, to the thinking and behavior of the Bolsheviks, 1917 through 1920, 21, 22. And much of what you see happening in the United States, particularly this business about men and women and erasing the differences and pretending there are none, all sort of business, that was all very prevalent. And it had a terrible impact in the Soviet Union to the point where Lenin had to put a stop to it. And then, of course, it largely died under Stalin, who had a different agenda. But if you go back to the first people that were in the Bolshevik Party, these Trotskyites and others, what you're hearing from a lot of these people is very similar. You go back to Leo Strauss in the United States, who led this whole neocon crusade from the very beginning, and he's heart and soul with the Bolshevism that I was just describing. And he used to lecture people saying the day is going to arrive and we'll realize there is no difference between the sexes. Well, none of this works. It will all collapse. And that's what I mean about the empire of lies. You build this empire and you tell people, and there are lots of well-meaning, gullible people who go along with it, but ultimately it fails. The truth will out. You can't keep it going. And I think that's happening very much so right now in Ukraine.
And I think there's a record of presidents getting reelected during war times. Is this war ultimately a tactic to get reelection for the current president?
I don't think so. Now, we do have a problem in the United States with this notion of war. We are very similar to Britain before 1914. War was always something that happened on someone else's soil. The result of this is that you develop an inflated view of yourself and your capabilities. If you go back before World War I, certainly before the Boer War, there was this attitude in Great Britain that they were the preeminent power. They were richer than everyone else. They could do pretty much what they wanted. The Boer War certainly changed a lot of people's views of the world, but even then it wasn't enough. It took World War I to really make a dent. And that's been one of my nightmares, that we would stupidly precipitate our involvement in something that could become a world war when there was no reason to, just as I personally believe, as my family did and my ancestors on both sides, that there was no reason for the British to go to war with Germany and Austria-Hungary in 1914. Absolutely none. And I think it did more to destroy the British Empire, which on the whole, I believe was a positive thing, not a negative thing, than anything else undertaken. So I worry that we're embarked on a similar course. But there's good news. Our economy can't keep up. The money printing is right behind us. You cannot substitute that in perpetuity for low productivity. So I think the whole financial lie is going to come home to roost just in time to prevent us from embarking on stupidity overseas. The other thing is that our armed forces are in terrible condition. The Army is in no position to fight the Russians. I don't think the British Army is either, sadly. And I think everybody in Europe is aware of that privately. So what do you do if you're a globalist and you're losing? This is the question. Do you do something really stupid? And that's what I worry about. Do we suddenly send forces into Western Ukraine once the Russians overrun everything in June, and in an attempt to somehow or another hold back the inevitable, and think that if we do this, this is going to somehow or another impress the Russians? The Russians are not impressed anymore. The Russians, if anything, the Russian people are furious. We should be grateful that Mr. Putin has turned out to be someone capable of exercising restraint. This is not someone who's given to emotion and ruled by emotion, thank God. But here we are ruled a lot by emotion, and that worries me.
Colonel, as a former military man, are people very surprised that when they first hear you speaking, you come off as anti-war? That must surprise people.
Yeah, I guess so. It depends. See, I have a different point of view because of my own experience in the military, what I experienced in 1990 and 91 and what I saw develop in the 90s and the Balkans and so forth. And I was one of these people who was not pleased at the end of operations in 91. I thought that we should complete the job and remove the government in Baghdad, simply place a new group of generals in charge, bring in the UN, and get out of the country. There was no reason to occupy anything. We should never have occupied anything. But the notion that we would bring all of these forces and then end it suddenly, prematurely, leaving essentially the strategic structure unchanged made no sense. Or if you're going to do that, then say, fine, let's do business with Saddam Hussein and make it clear to him if he'll do business with us, he can stay. We wouldn't do any of those things. So we end up being dragged in again. Then in the Balkans, I mean, the demonization of Serbia, when there was lots of guilt to go around, whether you were a Bosniak or a Croat, this was an ugly civil war. We intervened in that. I think we ended up humiliating the Russians unnecessarily in the wake of the Kosovo War campaign, which I thought at the time was stupid and unnecessary. And I had worked with the Russians off and on, and I saw only interest in good things. I did not see any hostility, and I think we blew it, frankly. We made terrible mistakes there. Then we walked into this thing in Iraq without understanding any of it. I mean, the idea was to drag in the U.S. Army into Iraq and keep it there. I never saw any serious thought given to purpose, method, and end state. In other words, what do we really want to achieve long run? Somebody said, well, we're going to have the first liberal democracy in the Arab world, and it will be friendly to Israel. Well, you might as well talk about all sorts of miracles occurring tomorrow morning that would cure every conceivable disease on the planet. That made no sense. It was a lot of nonsense. And we've continued down this path. And now here we are dealing with this troublesome business of expanding NATO, knowing full well that it would precipitate this crisis. Then we celebrate the war and decide this is our opportunity to destroy Russia. Why? What's the point of destroying Russia? Look, I was a professional soldier, and I killed people in combat. I loved being a soldier. But you have to have a purpose in mind, something that makes sense, a rational, attainable objective. The use of military power for the sake of using it is disastrous. I think it's killing us as a country. I mean, everyone complains about China. If you look at China, they come in with lots of cash and they offer to do things and expand their relations, but they're not interested in involving themselves in the internal affairs of other societies. We seem to want to involve ourselves in everyone's internal affairs. We don't seem to want to respect other people's cultures, other people's way of doing business. We're busy judging everyone else against an utterly meaningless standard because, quite frankly, things in the United States are not very good and haven't been for a very long time. One would think that given the destruction of our country, open borders, the ruination of our economy, I mean, everybody forgets that China did not come to the United States and invite everyone to come to China. They did not force us to export our industries, our scientific industrial base. You know, all of this was done in the 80s and the 90s and the early part of this century by people anxious to line their pockets. Once again, these elites. The elites have gotten us into real trouble. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And I don't know about a future election. I'm unconvinced that it would mean much. I see a lot of evidence that the left has now established itself in power, has no intention under any circumstances of ever giving it up.
In power, not just the presidency, you say, in all ways, shapes, and forms.
Well, of course. I mean, if you look at the alleged Republicans, with very few exceptions, there's not much difference between them and the Democrats. They're all on the same take. They're all profiting from the same disaster. The only people suffering in the United States are Americans. The Americans are the ones who don't have the protection of the police. The Americans are the ones who don't enjoy the Bill of Rights and the protections under it as they once did. The Americans are the ones that don't have freedom of speech. So It's hard for me to imagine an election working at this stage, especially with all this absentee ballot nonsense. I mean, the opportunities there for corruption are unending. I mean, the French tried it, didn't work. Several countries in Europe have tried these things and threw it out. And then treating the requirement to prove your citizenship as some sort of evil action that's designed to harm various racial groups is absurd. Makes no sense at all. So we've got real problems, and we'll see what happens over the next few months. But as things fall apart in Ukraine, that's going to be difficult to